Good afternoon, everyone. We will be starting our webinar in just a couple of minutes. My name is Leela, and we have a few more people who are still joining us. So we're just going to take a little bit of time to let that happen, and we look forward to chatting with you very soon. Well, welcome to the webinar. This is Leela Dewick. I'm the Communications Director at Ombudsman Saskatchewan. We're really happy that you could join us today. Our webinar is called Handling Complaints Under Your Code of Ethics, and we really hope that you find this a helpful and useful tool in your toolkit. Before we get started, though, I have a couple of housekeeping items that I just want to go over, and just to make sure that your audio is working properly, you want to check just on the right-hand side of your screen, there are some controls there, and if you can't see them, just look for that little orange rectangle with the white arrow and click on that, and it will open up that little panel with your controls. But what you want to do is make sure that if you are listening by phone, that you have picked phone call, and same for computer. This will help you not to have echoes and those kinds of things happening when we're speaking. So we hope you have the best experience possible there. And we also just want to note that you will be able to hear us. And although we won't be able to hear you, you do have a question box. So you can type in your questions and we can respond to them that way. And for the most part, we'll be responding to them verbally. And we will take questions at the end of the webinar. We'll try and save room to answer as many as we can. And any that we can't answer, we'll do some follow-up afterwards and try to make sure everyone has had some answers to their questions. Now, the other thing that I want to note as we're going in is that the kinds of questions that we can answer will be very general ones, because we don't want to give you advice, but we do want to provide you with general information about this topic, and we hope that you will find it quite useful. So I want to give you an opportunity just to test out that question box if you would like. Tell us what the weather is like in your area, and tell me if it's quite as slippery as it was yesterday. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce our presenters. We have Mary McFadgen with us today. She's our Ombudsman, and she has been our Ombudsman since April of 2014. We also have Paul Dawson with us today, and he is an assistant ombudsman, which means that he does quite a bit of investigation work for the office. So you've got two experienced presenters that I know that you'll enjoy hearing from. So meanwhile, you have typed in some weather notes for us. Somebody said it was foggy where they were, and someone else said that it was snowing and the sun was coming out, but we still have some slippery situations out there too. So thanks for testing that out for us. Now, before we turn the whole thing over to Mary and Paul, I have a couple more little tasks that I want to do with you. You've had an opportunity to see what they look like, and even though we can't see you, we want to find out a little bit about you. And we have a couple of polls that we would like you to do with us. And so, first of all, I just want to find out what kind of municipality you are with. So if you just take a moment and click on that option that best applies to you. and then we'll share the information back to you. Now, I recognize too that there are going to be a few of you out there who are maybe from both a rural municipality and a village or something like that. I know there are some combos out there, so that I guess you'll have your choice of which thing you want to pick as representing where you're at. So thank you for voting, and we will share these results back to you so you can see. Okay, so we have quite a few RMs and villages with us today, and also some towns and a few folks from cities. Thanks very much for sharing that with us. I have one more set of questions for you, and that just will help us to determine in total how many people were participating in our webinar today. So we know how many registrations we have, but not who's in the room with you. So it just helps us do a bit of a tally. Got a few more votes coming in. Okay, now I'll just share this information back to you. And so there you are. You can see there's a combination. Some people are listening on their own and a few others are in a group. So whichever your situation is, we hope that, that you really enjoy our webinar today. I'm going to turn over the controls now to Mary and to Paul, and they will guide you through our topic today.
Thank you very much, Leila. I will start first of all, and I want to give you just today's outline of what we're going to be talking about. So I welcome everybody for participating. This is the third time that we have done webinars. It's a really good way for us to reach people. We try to get out as much as we can and talk to groups in person, but it's a really good way to try to reach as many people as we can on a specific topic. And we really are happy that people are interested to hear from us. So that's very good. This is the third time we've done webinars specifically aimed at local municipal government. We did one when we first got jurisdiction to take complaints about municipalities back in 2016 that explained what our role was. We did a second one that dealt with what our role is with respect to reviewing conflict of interest complaints about council members. And then this is our third one in our series, and it's just talking about your code of ethics, because as Paul will get into, you have to have a code of ethics. The municipal legislation all says you do, and it also says you have to have a process to review and deal with contraventions if a council member contravenes the code of ethics. So really what the goal today is to give you some tips and help you think about the type of process your municipality should have or could have to help you deal with these matters. So I'm going to talk first of all a little bit about the Ombudsman's role. Paul's going to go into the municipal code, what your requirements are under legislation, and then we'll both go back and forth and talk about the things you should think about when you're setting up a complaint handling process. Okay, so just very quickly, not all of you have had the pleasure to have received a complaint about your services and had someone from my office phone you, so you maybe don't know what we do. So really, we are an office created under legislation, which is the Ombudsman Act, and we're appointed by the Legislative Assembly. And we have the mandate to take complaints about how municipal government organizations and provincial government organizations carry out their roles under legislation. We can take complaints from the public, and we can try to resolve them, or we can investigate the complaint to determine whether or not the organization carried out its role properly and according to law. And then from that, we make recommendations to try to fix the issues that we've uncovered, because our goal ultimately is to make sure that government organizations are carrying out their duties under legislation in a fair and reasonable manner for the public. And so we are an officer of the Legislative Assembly, our office, which means that we are not part of any government organization. So we're not part of any ministry or any crown corporation, and we do not take any orders from them. We are only accountable to the Legislative Assembly. So sort of in simple terms, how I try to explain that is, so we elect the Legislative Assembly and they pass laws. And then when they pass these laws of what their policy is and what they want to do, they assign different ministries or government organizations to carry out the roles under legislation. So what an ombudsman is a check and balance to make sure that when they're carrying out their role under legislation, all of these organizations, that they're doing so properly and according to law. So that's sort of in a nutshell what our role is. We're not a court. We're not advocates. We're neutral and impartial, and we are only accountable to the Legislative Assembly. Now, our office, we have about 26 employees. We are in, half of us are in Regina, half of us are in Saskatoon, but we go around to every part of the province. So that's in general what we are. And who can we investigate? Like I mentioned, most provincial government entities, we've been around since 1973, and so we've had jurisdiction since that time over provincial government entities, so they're very familiar with us. And of course, since November of 2015, we were given jurisdiction over all municipal entities, so all municipalities, and that included their council members. So just to put that in perspective a little bit, so for the first 40 years our office was in existence, we looked at provincial government organizations, and when you count them all up, like all the SaskPower, the SaskTel, all the ministries and boards, there are about 200 organizations. And then when our mandate was expanded, think about that, that's 780 municipalities in Saskatchewan, about that money, and about 4,400 council members. So our mandate really went up. It was a big change for our office. So that's who we can investigate. So what can we look at? So we look at matters of administration. So when people are carrying out their duties under legislation, we can look at whether or not they carry out those duties properly. We look at matters of administration. And then with respect to council members, we can look at whether or not we can receive allegations of conflict of interest, and we can also look at code of ethics complaints. So I think, so when I say matters of administration, what I think is really important for especially municipalities to understand is that we are not the policy makers. You, as an elected level of government, are entitled to make decisions. And as long as you do so according to law and follow the proper processes in order to make these decisions, you are entitled to do that. And we will not look at those decisions. So for example, if you want to close a road and it's not a popular decision, but you've followed the process, you've given public notice, we would not look at that matter. So people do complain to us because they're not happy with it, like there's an unpopular decision because some people don't want a road closed or they don't want a certain development. But as long as the council has done so according to law and followed all the processes properly, we would not look at that complaint. So now when I say that what we look at, we always say that we look if something did something wrong, or someone wasn't treated properly, or they weren't fair to a person. So that's what we look at when someone complains to us. And really in our legislation, these are the types of things that we look at. We look at whether or not it was contrary to an act. Were they oppressive? Was it discriminatory, wrong? Did they have the wrong information when they made a decision? Did they do it for an improper purpose? These are the types of things that we look at when we're looking at a complaint to see whether or not someone was treated fairly or reasonably. So now as an office, an ombudsman's office, we are an office of last resort, which means that ombudsman usually will not get involved in a complaint unless if there is a reasonable process to refer the person back to first. Because it's always better if organizations can carry out their duties and fix their problems without the Ombudsman getting involved. So lots of organizations have complaint processes in place, and we would refer somebody back to that process first if it was appropriate before we would get involved. So lots of times we will refer people back if they're complaining to us first that they didn't get their garbage picked up, for example. We usually would not open up a big formal investigation right away. We would say, have you phoned the town office and asked what was wrong? And we make them go and do that first before we would get involved. So as today, we are specifically talking about code of ethics complaints. As I mentioned before, the Ombudsman Act specifically says that we can look at allegations that a council member has contravened a code of ethics and the standards of value set up in that code of ethics. But as I mentioned, we usually will refer back. So if we got that complaint in the first instance, we would ask the complainant, have you gone to the municipality? Because every municipality is supposed to have a process to review code of ethics allegations that a council member has contravened the code of ethics. So we would, in the most part, refer the complainant back to you first to deal with it. And then if the complainant was not happy with that process or felt that the process wasn't fair or didn't act properly, we could look at that then to see whether or not the organization properly dealt with it under its code of ethics bylaw in a fair and impartial and objective manner. So it's normally we will refer back. There's some cases where we might investigate it in the first instance because we think it's not right to refer it back. So anyway, those are the types. If we do look at it, we might look at the actual contravention allegation, or we might look at how you as a council took steps to deal with that, because ultimately our goal is to make sure and help municipalities make sure that their administrative processes are working in a fair and reasonable manner. And ultimately, as we do in every investigation we do, we try to fix the issues that we uncover. We aren't there to make, we can't order a council member be removed from council. That's not our role. We want to make sure that processes are working in a fair and reasonable manner. And that councils they're the ones that are elected to be accountable to the citizens and the ratepayers, and they're the ones who ultimately should make decisions. We will make recommendations to them based on what we've investigated to help them decide what to do, but ultimately the decision is theirs. And if you want to have a look at how we've dealt with a lot of the municipal complaints where we've done formal investigations, we've put a lot of them on our website because we want you as municipal governments to have an opportunity to look at the types of issues we are investigating and how we've handled them. And to date, even though we can make recommendations to the Minister of Government Relations if we want, we've tried to keep it making recommendations to council so that they can fix the problems they see themselves. So that is, in a nutshell, what our role is. And now I'm going to hand it over to Paul, and he is going to talk a little bit about what your requirements are under legislation. So there you go, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Mary, and I just want to welcome everyone to the webinar and really thank you for attending. This is our second of 3 webinars that we're doing. You guys are a bit lucky in that we did one yesterday and got the first one out of the block, so hopefully we'll improve on that. And it's really great to see the participation that we've had on these webinars. And this is kind of a new format for me. I've never worked with these type of webinars before, so it's kind of a different experience than a regular classroom. So bear with me, but hopefully you find the experience helpful. And it's only an hour, so we keep our expectations relatively low, and hopefully you learn a few things about the code of ethics. One other thing I wanted to mention is make sure you use that questions panel, because if we can't answer your questions, I think Leela is going to group them and do a frequently asked questions at the end of this. And it really gives us a good sense as to some of the issues that are out there. So feel free to send those questions if you have one throughout this webinar. Just one other thing I wanted to acknowledge is part of my job is I have to contact a lot of CAOs and occasionally some council members and looking for information. And I just want to say I'm very impressed, particularly with the CAOs, the wealth of information that they have. And this is a new role for us, as Mary indicated, and it's also a new role for you guys to get calls from us. And the cooperation and information, regardless of where it is, has been awesome. So thank you all for that. Okay, so code of ethics. I'm going to briefly talk about the requirements that you all have for a code of ethics. And really, this applies if you have a code of ethics, if you don't have a code of ethics, or if you're not sure whether or not you have a code of ethics. So if you fall into any of those scenarios, that's perfectly fine. We're going to help you get on track so that everything is done by the book. And keep in mind, of course, this is a relatively new requirement, having only come into force in 2015. I realize that's 3 years ago, but some of you may be brand new counselors and you're new to the role, and I'm sure you have a long laundry list of things that you are learning with any new job. And like I say, it is a new process, so sometimes that does take a bit of time to get everybody up to speed, and hopefully this webinar will help you do that. So the legislation. Now, it really doesn't matter whether you fall under the Cities Act, the Municipalities Act, or the Northern Municipalities Act, because they all state the same thing. And they say that regardless of the act that you fall under, you have to have a code of ethics. You have to pass a code of ethics bylaw, and they even have you covered if you didn't pass that, because if you don't pass one, you are presumed to have one that is in the regulations. So let's start right with basics. What is a code of ethics? The best way I kind of think of a code of ethics, it's a set of standards or values, or almost like a rule book for council members that they must comply with when dealing with each other, dealing with their staff, and dealing with the public. And it contains things about being objective, being honest, being transparent, acting in the public interest, and not acting in your personal interest. And those are things that are all listed should be listed in your code of ethics bylaw, and they're definitely listed in the sample code of ethics that they've listed on the government relations site. And this isn't something that only applies to council members. Pretty much any job that has a public component has a similar type of process or code of ethics. If you look at doctors, they report to the College of Physicians, and they have codes that they need to abide by. Lawyers have the Law Society, in which there's certain things that they have to abide by. Police officers have an internal code of conduct, and also the Public Complaints Commission can look into complaints that deal with police. Like I said before, this did come into effect in 2015, so part of our role and our goal is to kind of get everybody on board, and makes it easier for you and it makes it easier for us, and we certainly consider that to be a win-win. And if you don't have a code of ethics, or you're not sure, you have one, because you are presumed to have one that is listed in the regulations. And I think sometimes towns and villages and RMs, they're almost hesitant to advertise or speak about it, because they think, well, maybe we'll start getting complaints, and we're going to kind of hopefully put your mind at ease. That's not a bad thing if that actually happens, and you're aware of your process and you understand it. Okay, so you are presumed to have a code of ethics, but what they didn't do is they didn't include a sample process for dealing with contraventions. So they've kind of got the rule book and the standards and values, but they didn't set out a process in terms of what happens if someone wants to make a complaint. And that's what we're going to hopefully help you with, so you have both components, both the code of ethics and the process for dealing with potential violations. And really, that's why we're here today. And it's only an hour, but you know, hopefully this gives you pause for thought. And if there's other information you need, we're always available, as well as government relations. And there's other sources that'll get you thinking to make sure that your RM town or village is on track. If you think of it, the code, it's simply the rules that you need to abide by, and the process is what you're going to have to develop to investigate or look into those potential breaches. The code of ethics is really kind of the easy part. These are the standards you need to abide by. But for the process, you really want to put some thought into it, because you want to make sure your process is rock solid. And part of that is going to be determining how to receive, review, decide, so that it is done properly. And as Mary likes to say, if you have an unfair process, it's probably going to lead to an unfair decision, and that's something that you definitely do not want. Okay, the question of the day: what are the key elements of a fair and effective code of ethics complaint handling process? So this is a bit of a sneak peek into Mary's part of the presentation. So let's just summarize the points that I tried to cover off here. Code of ethics simply equals a standards for conduct of all councillors. You need to pass a bylaw. If you don't, you're presumed to have the one that is in the regulations. And the process to investigate, there is no sample process, and that's why we're here to help you come up with that, so that your public has an avenue to make complaints and that they're investigated properly at your local town, village, resort village, or what have you. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background on the Code of Ethics, and I'm going to turn it over now to Mary, who's going to explain the key elements of a fair and effective complaint handling process. So take it away, Mary.
Thank you, Paul. And as Paul said, so just to reiterate again, because the sample or all the legislation says is that you have to have a process to deal with these contravention allegations, that there's a contravention of a code of ethics, but there isn't much guidance. So you're given as a municipality really wide discretion to adopt a process that will fit your needs. And as Paul said, today our goal is to give you some things to think about when you establish a process that will fit your needs. So when you think of setting up a complaint handling process, there's sort of some key elements that are something you need to think about. The first one is how a complaint is made. So it should be an easy to make a complaint. People should be able to find how to make a complaint and should understand what they need to do. Again, think about the many times any of us have tried to phone and make a complaint about our credit card bill, and how many times we've been, pushed around from one phone call to another person. It sometimes can be very difficult. So it's just to make sure that's one thing to think about, because you don't want people in your municipality to feel the same way. So make it easy and understandable, easy to access. And then the second thing is, once you get a complaint, you should think about handling it promptly. And when you look at it, you should look at it objectively and confidentially. And if you can resolve it, you should try to resolve it at the earliest possible time that you can. And then finally, once you've done a fair and objective review of a complaint, if a council member has been found to contravene it, that you take proper steps to impose reasonable sanctions on the council member. So those are sort of the key elements that your process should address. And these are just 4 things to think about. And really, maybe when you've set up a draft process, think about these 4 questions about when you've looked at, okay, is it based on fairness? Is it accessible? Does it respond? And is it efficient? So these are things you can think about. And if you can really answer yes to those questions once you've set up your process, you are doing a very, very good job. So now to help you set up a good process, what we're first going to look at is how you let people make complaints, and then how, once you've got the complaint, what you do with it. These are really the key processes. And then eventually, if after you respond, what you do with respect to sanctions. So now I'm going to hand it over to Paul, and he's going to deal with the first part of enabling complaints. So I think I have given the mouse to Paul. Go ahead.
Okay, so enabling complaints. And in order to have a code of ethics that really works for your town or village or RM, I would say that as a council, you really have to be on board with what it says. You don't want it to be one of those things that, you know, when it does come into play, you go and find it and take it off the shelf and blow the dust off of it. You have to really have a good understanding of what's in it, because if you don't have a good understanding of what's in that code, how can you expect members of the public to have an understanding of that? So that would be my first point, is that you really have to develop a good understanding of what's in that code. What are those expectations? What are those standards and values? And it shouldn't be something that you're unsure of. It should be something that you're well aware of. These are the expectations. These are the standards and values that I have to abide by. Now, if you don't have a full understanding of that, that's fine too. And I sort of liken this to the, you know, when you sign up for your Apple iPhone or whatever, you have that long list of terms and conditions and nobody reads it. It's just at the very bottom, you tick off that box and you feel like you're good to go. So that's probably what we wouldn't encourage for this role here. We want you to be active participants in understanding what is in your code, so you have a really clear understanding of what's in it. Because if you don't, that can be very problematic. So because other members of your community may be well versed in what's in there. So print it off and work towards developing a clear understanding of the document and a culture in your RM of understanding of what's there. Really, that should be your goal, where the entire council has a really clear understanding of that, and they aren't afraid of it or aren't afraid of the process. And it's not a bad thing if you start to get complaints about that code of ethics. So that's number one, is that you want to clearly understand the role so that you're able to pass that information then on to the public, who is the second part of it. Okay, so let's assume now that you guys all have a good understanding of what the code of ethics is for your town, and if not, I'm sure you'll get on that so you do understand it. And oftentimes what happens is we'll get calls from ratepayers in a community, and they'll tell us about a complaint, and we'll say, you know, geez, that sounds like something that it's right in the code of ethics. Have you made a complaint about that to your RM or town or village? And they'll say the code of what? And I've never heard of this. I didn't know there was a process. And sometimes we get calls from counselors as well, and they want to make a complaint maybe about another counselor, and I'll say, geez, you know, that sounds like something that would fall under the code of ethics for your town or village. And sometimes they're not as aware of it as they should be. So you want to really educate your public as to, you know, what is in that code and how they can make complaints. And so participating in today, you're actually educating yourself about this topic, and hopefully you leave here better informed than when you were arrived. And then you can turn to the next step, which is educating the public. And really that's entirely up to you how you want to do that and what works for your community. You obviously know your community better than Mary or I do, but some possible options is advertise it on your website or call up your local newspaper and have them do a story on what the code of ethics process is, or hold community town hall meetings so that the public is educated as to what this process is. And when you promote the process to the public, this is your chance to provide the public with information that they need. And my recommendation would be to keep your messaging very simple. Probably most people haven't heard of the code of ethics and how it works, and it really is not meant to be a convoluted or confusing system. It's meant to be, you know, very user friendly. And you want to make sure that, you know, this is not a catch-all for all the complaints that are out there for your given RM or town or village. If someone calls up and is upset that garbage day was moved from Thursday to Tuesday, it may be an important issue to them, but that's not something that would normally fall under the code of ethics. How a complaint is received: there is a sample complaint form on the government relations site, and it's definitely a good start. It's a bit formal, but you can have a look at it and see if it works for you. And there's nothing wrong with taking the best parts out of that and adding what you think would make it even better. And it kind of, it's called the Schedule A, and it is a form used to start the formal process for a complaint. And again, when you're messaging to your public, our advice would be to keep your messaging simple. This is meant to be a fairly straightforward process, and nobody wants a system that is overly onerous or cumbersome. So follow the KISS principle and keep it simple. So now you have, you've educated yourself on the code of ethics, you've educated the public. Don't forget about your staff, because they're the ones who are going to really be on the front lines when the rubber hits the road here. So make sure that they're prepared, that they understand the code of ethics, and they understand the process. And then if you actually start to get complaints, that's really not a bad thing. And what we found with a lot of towns and villages and RMs is, admittedly, they're maybe a bit fearful of the process when they haven't dealt with a complaint. And then as soon as they start to deal with some complaints, they're off to the races, and it's not as nearly as bad as what they imagined it was. One other thing we want to talk about is dealing with complaints informally. You don't have to turn every single complaint that comes in into a super formal process. There's probably many times that you deal with issues informally, and there's no reason why you can't do the same for code of ethics. And it's always in everyone's best interest to try and resolve complaints at the lowest possible level. So if you are resolving some of these informally, and that may just be by a phone call or an explanation, then by all means keep doing that. And the way I liken that is if any of us go out for supper and we're not satisfied with the meal and we want to pursue a complaint, and someone said, okay, come over here, I've got 5 pages of forms for you to fill in and swear an affidavit, and all, you kind of just throw up your hands and say that's kind of ridiculous. So there definitely is a place for resolving issues informally. So don't stop doing that if you already are doing that. Okay, so some other reminders for your staff is they're really on the front line, so they need to be well versed in the code and the process, because they're the ones that are going to be handling those complaints. And not every complaint needs to go through a formal process, and try to develop a culture of resolving issues at the lowest possible level. And as for informal complaints, I wish I could give you a black and white answer as to what complaints you can resolve formally and which ones you can't. Like I say, you're probably already doing that very well. You know when something can be resolved informally, and you know when it can't. Some complainants may insist on a formal process, and you can never go wrong by going through that formal process. But just I would ask the complainant, you know, what are your wishes for this? And we make the same mistake here when sometimes we deal with complaints, we have in our minds that we think that they want a big, long, drawn-out formal investigation, when sometimes they just want somebody to talk to, or they want to vent a little bit, or they just want an explanation. They're not looking for anything super formal or anything like that. They just want to know the reason why something happened, some of these can be resolved perhaps very quickly with just a phone call or two, or even a simple answer. And I think we forget, probably both of us, both the Ombudsman and you guys deal with some people that can be very, very unreasonable, and that can wear an organization down. And you know, I'm probably we can relate to each other. But you also have to keep in mind there is some people that are very reasonable, and sometimes they're just looking for an explanation. So try not to group everybody in as being unreasonable, although sometimes can be difficult to do that. So setting up your formal complaint process. So how do you start out with the information? How do you get that information? Government Relations, like I say, has a Schedule A complaint form, and it's a good start in my opinion. It may be a bit formal, but it's got everything you need on there in terms of starting to get a handle on what the complaint is. So it's very basic things like, what is the complainant's name and address? What is their best way to contact them? what is the RM or town or village or city that they're complaining about, and give me a brief description of the alleged contravention. And by brief, I mean, 5 or 6 lines or 1 paragraph. You definitely don't need 10 pages of information to give a brief description as to what the alleged contravention was. And it's all on 1 page, which I like. It's everything is contained right on there. So when you're setting up that process, some other things to keep it simple, which is what we would recommend. You don't need to have any fees for anyone making a complaint. Make it accessible. So there's different avenues how they can get that complaint to you: mail, fax, email. One point to keep in mind is about confidentiality when you're setting up that system. So if you have a group email account that everybody has access to, and that's the email you're using for complaints, that's probably not the best method because you have so much access to it. Similarly, you wouldn't want a list of complaints sitting on the in the lobby of the town office. So just keep that in mind. I'm sure it's things you're already dealing with other aspects of your work as well. Likely most of the complaints are going to be received by the administrator or the clerk. Unless you're a bigger city, you may have an integrity commissioner, but I'd say 99% of them would be that administrator or clerk role is going to be receiving them. Always be mindful of complainants that may have special needs. Not everybody has access to a computer to send it online, or if you have an app developed or something like that. So provide different options for people in making their complaints. And you're going to need to decide how to address third-party complaints and anonymous complaints, how to deal with those type of situations. Now, before I turn it over to Mary, we've had a lot of information over the first 40 minutes here, so we have a little bit of levity. I believe this is an old Herman cartoon, if I'm dating myself. I'm not sure if Herman is still around, but you can see the lineup there of complaints and gratitude. The gratitude complaint taker is reading a book there. He's not too busy. And so when we show this slide on our fair practice training, and I always look at it and say, well, that's something I can definitely relate to here because we deal with complaints all the time. And then a lot of people in the towns and villages say, well, I can relate to that too. And then I start to think about it, pretty much everyone can relate to this slide. Let's just face it, people do like to complain. So don't be hard on yourselves. That's just across the board. People do like to complain. But hopefully, if you have a good process set up, it becomes more familiar to you and you're able to work through those complaints so that they're fair. And at the end of the day, they may not like the answer that you came to, but the process you went through was fair and it was the right answer. So now I'm going to hand it over to Mary, who is going to talk about actually responding to the complaints.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So yes, as Herman on the page before said, okay, now you've made your process really good and accessible, and understandable. People can access this. Now, what do you do with the complaint once you've got it? So that's what we're going to talk about next. And really, ultimately, your goal is that you have to make sure that the allegation that you've received in the complaint, whether or not a council member contravened the code of ethics, is true or not true. And so to do that, you need to do it quickly, you need to do it in an objective and fair manner, and to do that, you need to have a good investigation process. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. Okay, there we go. Okay, so when your investigation process, you have to make sure that everybody involved in the process, every stage from the start when it comes in till ultimately when your council makes a decision of whether or not a contravention has happened or not happened, it has to be, everything has to be done fair. So from the person at the counter till the ultimate decision maker. That means being respectful and being courteous. And I know that there are a lot of you out there who have the same people coming in every day complaining about the same thing. They don't like the answer that they've received. But we as public officials carrying out a public duty still have to remain courteous and respectful to people. We have to maintain confidentiality That's really important, especially if you're in a small municipality. If someone has made a complaint, they will not be happy if they feel that you were having coffee at Tim Hortons and you were talking about their complaint and other people in the municipality heard it. We get that, the Tim Hortons syndrome, quite a bit, so very much think about that. And so those are the things to think about. Your whole process has to be fair. So then we're going to go through, so everybody involved has to be fair. Now we're going through what we think are the key steps of any investigation process and what you need to do to think about that to make sure your process meets good standards for setting up a good process. So the first thing you do is when you get a complaint, you've got the long line of people that are showed up in the Herman cartoon, you have to look at it, you have to acknowledge it. And then I'm going to go to the next slide because I'm going to talk about all those 8 separately. So first thing you have to do is acknowledge it and try to do that quickly. Like if it comes in, don't let it sit for a month on your desk without letting the person know that you've received it and what you're going to do with it. That's very important. And it might be that to tell them how it will be dealt with, you may have that already in your brochure of how you've advertised your process and how it's going to work. So you can refer them to the information to say, this is how it's going to work, and this is how long we think it will take. And then once you get a complaint, as we do when we get a complaint, we see if it meets the definition of, could it be, is it something that would fall under the contravention of a code of ethics? So if you remember, the Code of Ethics has to set up your values and standards for your council members. So if someone has come to you and they're complaining about the garbage not being picked up, and they file a complaint because they're mad at the council member that lives next door to them because their garbage didn't get picked up, perhaps that is not something that should be dealt with under the Code of Ethics. It should be maybe dealt with in another way, like phoning the person who's responsible in the municipality for making sure the garbage gets picked up on a certain date. So just someone has to be given the authority under your bylaw to make that initial assessment to see if it's something that should be dealt with under the Code of Ethics complaint process. And even if it comes to you in that case and it's nothing that falls under the Code of Ethics thing, make sure that you give an explanation to the person as to why it's not being dealt with and how you're planning on dealing with it, because that's very important. So once you've acknowledged that you've received to the complainant, then you should notify the council member who has been complained about. They have a right to know that a complaint has been made against them, and it might be when it's raised with them, it might be something that can be resolved informally. Like Paul said, we can't give you a list of what would be appropriate to be resolved informally or not. It will totally depend on the facts and the relationship between the person who's complaining and the council member. It may be as simple as the council member didn't return a phone call, the complainant feels in a timely manner. So that might be something that could be resolved informally by the council member just phoning the ratepayer. So those are the things that could be dealt with. But ultimately, the council is the one who at the end will decide how to address the contravention of the code and how to deal with it. So they have to be notified as well. So you've notified everybody. Now you've got the complaint. Again, as Paul said, and we try to do this in every complaint we receive, is before we will start a formal investigation, we look to see if it's something that can be resolved informally. And again, usually it would be a case where both parties will agree that that can be done informally, and hopefully most of your cases will be dealt with like in this manner. We can deal with most of our cases this way and don't do investigations in all of our files, but you will know when things are appropriate to try to resolve informally or not. But if they can't be resolved informally and you have to actually investigate it, these are sort of when an investigation is being done, and whoever the council decides is going to do the actual investigation, these are the steps that we think any good investigation will have. Someone has made an allegation, so that's number one. Clarify what the issue is that you're investigating. Then find out the facts. This is really important. So if the allegation is that so-and-so contravened the code of ethics, find out what the facts were and make sure you get the facts directly from the person. Be careful of assuming that somebody said something or somebody did something, because if you don't get the facts right, down the road, whatever you decide is probably not going to be the right decision. So the facts are the most important thing when you're doing an investigation. And then once you've got your facts, then you need to apply the law. We find this as a fact. By him doing that, did it violate the code of ethics? Did he contravene that? Look at what your code of ethics says and determine whether or not they did contravene the code of ethics. So those are the key steps of an investigation. So now once you've got your investigation done, you've done your facts, you've looked at what the code says, you've determined whether or not you feel there was a violation based on the facts, applying the law to it, then the council member who has been complained about needs to have an opportunity to respond. He should not be involved in the process of deciding how the complaint should be reviewed or in the final decision. Even the rest of council will do that, but they need to have the opportunity to review the findings that council has made to determine, to make an opportunity to be heard before any final decision is made. We have that obligation under our legislation. So if we are finding that a municipality or a provincial government organization did something that we feel was wrong or not proper, when we do a preliminary report, we have an obligation under law to send it out to the organization and give them an opportunity to provide us with any further information we need to consider before we make a final or issue a final report on the matter. Because you never know, they might have information that is contrary to what you have in your report, and that's really important for you to consider before council makes a final decision. And also, sometimes, depending on what the case is, you may want to give the complainant who has complained to you the same opportunity to review the findings of fact. It might be a case where there's alternate two sides of a story where it might be appropriate, but that'll be a decision that you will have to make. Okay, so now once you've given the council member an opportunity to respond, you've taken it into consideration. Now you as a council have to decide how to deal with this allegation or this complaint that you received. So you reviewed the information. Everybody reviewing it on the council should be impartial, not have any bias one way or the other towards the complainant or the other council member. Look at the information and make a conclusion, which is, did the council member contravene the code of ethics? Now, there'll be some things that you will want to discuss in camera. There will be, just remember that under the municipal legislation, a decision on a matter cannot be made in camera. So just to keep that in mind when you're doing your process. So then, you decided, did the council member, he or she, contravene the code of ethics by their actions? And if they have, then it's you as a council have to decide how to deal with the contravention that you found. Think about, it should be reasonable. There's certain things under legislation you can't do to a council member. There's some things that you would be able to do. One of the things to look at, there is a list. It's not a complete list, but there is as Paul mentioned, and this is one of the questions about what website we can find the complaint form that Paul was talking about. So if you go to the Ministry of Government Relations website, they have a sample code of ethics bylaw. It's a little more detailed than the one that is attached to the regulations. and it has a little bit more procedural steps in it for how to deal with a complaint if you get one. And then it has the one attached, the sample complaint form attached to it. So just for that question, it's on the Ministry of Government Relations website. But in that code, in that bylaw, it also has a list of possible courses of actions or sanctions that you could take towards a council member. For example, saying that they should apologize to the person, or that they should get some training, they should repay certain funds, or they should be removed from certain committees. So those are the types of things, again, that you sort of need to think about when it should be reasonable and it should be an appropriate response to, it should be in fitting to what the contravention was. You know, it shouldn't be too severe if the contravention wasn't that severe, is what I'm trying to say. You need to be reasonable as decision makers. And ultimately, once you've made your decision, was the complaint founded, did he contravene the code of ethics, he or she contravened the code of ethics or not, you have to give reasons for your decision to both the complainant and the council member, of whether it's yes, he or she did contravene it, or whether they did not. And people like to get reasons, so you need to make sure that they're reasonable, they're meaningful, that someone will understand them. We get lots of complaints from people who have had a decision made against them that is just says, no, we're not giving you that benefit, for example, but they have not been given any reasons why. And I'll tell you, sometimes people, like, they're not happy that, for instance, in that case, a provincial government organization isn't giving them benefits they thought they were entitled to. But unless there's a good explanation explaining why you're not entitled to those benefits, it's hard for you to understand. And lots of times when people get the explanation about why they're not entitled to a certain benefit, for example, they understand now why. They still might not be happy, but at least they've got a good reason and they understand that. And it is a little bit easier for people to accept a decision that they're not happy with if they've been given the reason why a decision was made a certain way. And quite frankly, if you've made a decision a certain way, if you can't defend it and put something down in writing explaining why you've made a decision and why you're imposing or not imposing a sanction, then maybe you haven't done a good investigation of it or reviewed it properly, because at the end of the day, if you've done a good process, you will have a good decision that will stand up to scrutiny. And then, of course, every time when you're making a final decision on a matter, the people should have an opportunity to clarify if they don't understand the reasons, and ask questions of the person making the decision. Okay, so other considerations when you're setting up your process that you might want to consider is, we know that you, like us, sometimes do get people that complain or they complain about the same thing constantly, and you've already given them a decision, but they keep coming back, or they are presenting themselves with unreasonable conduct. Again, none of us deserve to be treated rudely or sworn at or physically abused in our workplaces. And so if you're if you have somebody who is showing that type of behavior, you should have the ability to deal with that, because it's very important. You have to protect your staff, and your staff has to be treated in a respectful manner. It's good to think about having a process for that, because you want to make sure, because most of you come from small municipalities, that you're treating everybody the same way. So it's just that you make sure that you've got a process in place to deal with unreasonable conduct, and that you're not treating, Joe different than Mary because you don't like Joe. You have to make sure that you apply it consistently to everybody. And it might be that maybe that'll be the subject of our next webinar next year, is thinking about setting up an unreasonable complainant conduct. We'll see if anybody has any ideas or thinks that's a good idea, but certainly let us know. Okay, well, here we are. It's 2 minutes to 10. just some final thoughts before we'll try to answer a couple of questions here is we know that taking complaints, this is our bread and butter here. It can be complicated, it can be time consuming and stressful, but I will tell you, if you have a good process in place to deal with them and are not doing it sort of when one comes in and what do we do with it, you will be far better served by having a good process, and you will feel confident in how you're dealing with these complaints. And anyway, that's sort of what I wanted to say. Paul, do you have anything you want to add as final thoughts?
Just the only thing I'll add, because we talked a little bit about it here, is about the informal process, and I would encourage you to keep that up. And I look at it in our office, if every complaint that we took went through a formal process, we'd probably need 100 staff and 4 or 5 ombudsmen, and at the end result would not be very productive. So that's something you really want to focus on. A lot of these complaints can be handled informally without a formal process. But obviously there is times when you have to use that process, and you'll be hopefully more knowledgeable about that process having gone through this webinar.
Right. Now, before we sign off, I was just looking at the questions that came in, just to let everybody know that we will be putting the slideshow of the webinar on our website. We also have a brochure that we developed that is how to set up a good complaint process under the Code of Ethics. And it's a brochure that is available on our website. Just to clarify, so under the Code of Ethics, under the legislation, it is standards and values that council has to follow and in how it treats employees, other council members, and the general public. So all of those people have a right to complain about the conduct of a council member. So that is something to think about. And again, ultimately, anybody who's not happy with if a municipality dealt with a complaint and they don't think it was dealt with properly under the Code of Ethics complaint process that the municipality has set up, we can look at that to see whether or not we think it was done in a proper manner and according to law. So we do have that also authority to accept complaints and look at those. So now I think that is sort of the general things. I maybe just want to end by saying there are some questions here that are a little unique to the municipality, so we won't deal with those now or put those in an FAQ, but we'll get back to you on those. The general question, there's some good questions here that we'll put in our FAQs. One thing I just want to say before we end is that you might want to get some legal advice on. I know some municipalities in setting up their process have had some legal advice in drafting it. So always consider doing that before you move forward with something. So other than that, I know we're after 11, so we're taking up people's time. So I really want to thank everybody for participating, and let us know if you think it's a good idea that we do the unreasonable complainant conduct and how to handle that next year. So goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
And have a good rest of your day. There will be some follow-up emails that will catch up with you shortly. Have a good one.